There was no evidence that Mr. Noriega was involved in drugs, no hard evidence until we indicted him.
Does the NSA collect any type of data at all on millions or hundreds of millions of Americans?
No, sir.
It does not.
Not wittingly.
Have we ever tried to meddle in other countries' elections?
Oh, probably, but it was for the good of the system.
Oh, we don't mess around in other people's elections, Jim?
All right, welcome back to another episode of Rackets podcast. I'm your host, Brian Sadie. This podcast covers a lot of topics, organized crime, drug cartels, but it also covers the white-collar racketeers, such as corporate criminals, crony capitalists, corrupt government officials, etc. And with that said, I've got really the perfect guest on the show here today. His name's Philip Mattera. He's from a nonprofit group called Good Jobs First. And he has a few titles there. He's the research director and the director of corporate research project. He's also the author of an excellent blog called the Dirt Diggers Digest, which focuses on corporate crime. So welcome to the show, Philip.
Thanks.
If you would, do you mind telling the listeners a little bit about your organization?
Yeah, well, the way I like to identify myself is in connection with the Corporate Research Project, which is an effort to do a couple of things. Originally, it was designed to do research on specific corporations for various labor unions, environmental groups, and other kinds of progressive campaigns. And the idea was to provide strategic research, that is information that could be used as leverage in various efforts to, get corporations to do the right thing, or at least to stop doing the wrong thing.
Right.
And we still do some of that, but increasingly in recent years, the emphasis has been on providing tools that allow activists and researchers kind of to do their own research on corporations, and to provide resources that are kind of shortcuts and that help people find the best, kind of the juiciest information most easily. And so among those tools are, first, a pretty extensive guide to doing corporate research that we have on the Corporate Research Project website. And that website, by the way, is corp-research.org. And there's a guide there with hundreds and hundreds of different sources of information and an explanation of how to go about, researching a company, particularly if it's a company you haven't dealt with before and you're starting from scratch. And the focus is on doing it efficiently, and not doing things like Google searches, which are going to, give you a lot of kind of crap, but kind of directs you to the best sources that give you the kind of information that can be put to best use in campaigns. The second set of tools are what I call corporate rap sheets, and these are extensive kind of narrative profiles of kind of the biggest and baddest corporations around. So, the big pharmaceuticals, the big oil companies, the big banks, et cetera. And basically it's a rundown of their track record, emphasizing their corrupt activities of one kind or another. And the aim is to, include as many links as possible back to original source material, so that you can, see where the narrative account came from. The third and most ambitious tool that we've developed is Violation Tracker. And so whereas rap sheets are kind of narrative accounts, the covering about 75 companies. The violation tracker is meant to be a more comprehensive set of information in more of succinct kind of database form. And the aim is to eventually contain information about just about every conceivable type of corporate crime and misconduct. And so far, the initial emphasis was on federal regulatory agencies and Justice Department cases. So what we've done is collected data from all these agencies on various cases involved. Now we have data from more than 40 agencies and all the divisions of the Justice Department. And these are, come from various types of data. So a lot of them are from, big regulatory agencies like the EPA and OSHA, and those agencies make available, a big data set of cases involving penalties against companies. In other cases, companies put out annual reports about their enforcement activities, and we've kind of scooped up that information. For other agencies, we've had to just use press releases where because they don't put out anything in a more comprehensive form, but the press releases are a pretty good source for the information. So the idea is to put together primary source documents showing a wide range of corporate misconduct. So, for example, it's got environmental violations, occupational safety violations. It's got wage and hour violations. It's got discrimination cases. It's got price fixing cases. It's got all sorts of things, foreign corrupt practices, there's foreign bribery cases. So what we've done is brought together the basic information about all those cases, including key pieces of information like the dollar amount of the penalty paid, and put it in searchable form in this database, and then to kind of add some additional information. So, for example, we have our own kind of tagging system for categorizing these cases, and then we also link the companies mentioned in the individual cases to their ultimate corporate parents, because usually when these cases are announced, the agency or the Justice Department doesn't necessarily tell you that this company is a subsidiary of some larger entity. Exactly. And often it's not obvious from the name. And one of the prime examples is Berkshire Hathaway, which has, Warren Buffett has this benign image, but he's actually, he controls dozens and dozens of companies with different names, and a lot of them have racked up a lot of penalties of various kinds.
Most
Burlington Northern, his railroad by itself, has hundreds and hundreds of safety violations from the Federal Railroad Administration.
And I think he's a major shareholder in Wells Fargo, if I'm remembering.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, that's in your top 10 violators right there.
Yeah. So what we do is, link the individual entries to their ultimate parent, and that's cases in which the ultimate parent has a majority ownership stake in the entity. And then we aggregate those penalties so that you can see kind of the grand totals of the penalties. And as you mentioned, we have a list of the largest the companies with the most in aggregate penalties, and these are the companies that have been involved in the major scandals. A lot of them are banks, but also BP, of course, and Volkswagen.
Right.
And a little bit farther down the list, we've got a lot of the big pharmaceutical companies, and and Walmart, of course,
right.
and some of the big auto companies like Toyota that have had some big safety scandals. So it's a pretty wide-ranging list, because the data we collect is basically on any company goes into the mix if there's a penalty of at least $5,000 against it, and we then link the individual entries to a universe of about 3,000 large corporations. And those are, we start with things like the Fortune 1000, the Forbes list of the largest privately held companies, and then a bunch of other lists. We also do nonprofits, especially nonprofit hospitals, because they tend to rack up a lot of penalties. So it's basically a pretty wide-ranging list of large businesses
I'm kind of
that
curious with
we aggregate for.
Oh, I'm sorry to interrupt you. But with the nonprofit hospitals, what kind of penalties? I'm guessing with False Claims Acts, or?
Yeah, above all, False Claims Act.
Okay.
I mean, there's other, there are other kinds of penalties, and anyone can, if you go to the Violation Tracker website, which you could find at violationtracker.org, there's a link there to agency data sources, and it shows you all of the original sources that we use to gather the data. So it's it shows you, for example, the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services. There are several categories of violations there involving healthcare providers. The False Claims Act cases come, from the Justice Department, Civil Division. So, we've got, a pretty wide variety, and we, you could search the data. Either if you're interested in a particular large company, you can go directly to a summary page for any one of these 3,000 corporations and see kind of the big picture and the totals, and then there are links to all the individual entries that are associated with that. But if you're interested in a smaller company, you could search that too, just by searching the company name on the main page of the site. And we also make it possible, to search by the type of offense, by the penalty amount, by the agency, by the different characteristics of the parent company, if you're only interested, for example, in privately held parents, or if you're interested in parents that are headquartered in a particular state. We also let you do the search, narrowing it down by presidential administration, so that if you want to compare Obama and Trump, you can do that. In fact, I just cooperated with Public Citizen on a report that did just that compared the enforcement track record of, during Trump's first 12 months to the final years of the Obama administration. Of course, there's been a big plunge in the penalty totals during this time.
Yeah, I've read that report, and I was pleasantly surprised, because generally media really doesn't care about white-collar crime. But that report it was picked up by several different media organizations.
Yeah, the biggest break was that the Associated Press ran a story about it that got reprinted in hundreds of other publications, and then there were some others that did their own original stories.
Right. Yeah, there's this general malaise when it comes to white-collar crime, even though it's the much more destructive crime. And one of the things I wanted to bring up is that you're doing work that the U.S. government has been reluctant to do. Most people aren't aware, but Representative John Conyers, I think back 2010, I think it was, he wrote a bill to try to start a corporate crime database. There's never been any interest. He keeps resubmitting this bill year after year. Again, there's just no interest in Congress to even track this information, let alone to actually crack down on white-collar crime. All he's asking for is a database, essentially, to do what you do. And again, you guys don't have the same quite as much power. You don't have subpoena power, I should say.
No, unfortunately not. Yeah, well, actually, it goes back, farther. I mean, Ralph Nader has been talking about this for, probably a few decades now. And, he recently put together an open letter to the Attorney General about this, renewing the call for a public database. And, of course, nothing has happened as a result.
He's the rule of law guy. But
yeah. Yeah, and the point that Nader and Conyers have made is that the FBI has been putting out reports on street crime for like 75 years. So there's every year there's this report with often getting screaming headlines about the extent of street crime, even though street crime has actually been going down in recent years. But for a long time they use these statistics to justify kind of repressive policies. But there's never been a comparable official data source on corporate and white collar crime. And the Violation Tracker is kind of designed to fill that void. And if the federal government ever decides to do it, I can retire and let them take it over.
Hand over the reins.
That's right.
Yeah, and what you're talking about is a really important point, because the financial damage from white-collar crime is so much larger from the financial damage from street crime. I mean, street crime just pales in comparison. And I really wish that, all listeners would check out your website. It's obviously a great resource for, activists or journalists, but just, the average person who's interested in this topic, I really think that they would be blown away at, like you say, the rap sheets of certain companies, and just, how certain industries are just prone to all types of criminality.
And it's not just financial harm. I mean, it can be a matter of life and death.
You're right.
I mean, when you look at what, in the environmental area or the occupational safety area, or some of the stuff that the pharmaceutical companies do,
absolutely,
this can cause real physical harm or even death.
Yeah. You're right, and that is an oversight on my part there. One thing I wanted to ask you about, and because I'm pretty familiar with corporate crime, and this falls within the category of corporate crime, but I got to admit that I really didn't know a whole lot about wage theft, and I read your report, and that really opened my eyes. If you could, do you mind kind of just telling us all a little bit about that report and some of the information in it?
Sure. So this report was based on the first step in moving Violation Tracker beyond the regulatory agencies and the Justice Department into the realm of private litigation. And so the category we chose to begin with was cases where companies are basically cheating their employees out of their proper pay. Now, it's bad enough that wages have been stagnating, but on top of that, employers all too often don't pay even what they're supposed to pay based on those low wage rates. And what they engage in is a variety of practices, including forcing people to work off the clock. That is, you come in and before you, kind of, I don't know how often people literally punch clocks anymore, but before you actually sign in, there are certain tasks that you're supposed to perform. Or, you sign out and then there are other tasks that you're expected to do. So basically, it's extra work that you're not being paid for. Another big issue has to do with misclassification, and that is certain workers are improperly designated as being exempt from overtime pay, so that they work more than 40 hours a week and they don't get the proper time and a half compensation that they're supposed to under the Fair Labor Standards Act. And there are several other related issues at the state level. California has additional rules having to do with break times. Workers are supposed to be provided a certain amount of time in rest breaks or meal breaks, and employers are always violating those rules. So theoretically, these abuses are prosecuted or enforced by the Wage and Hour Division of the Labor Department, and they do that, but there's so much of it that they can't keep up. So instead, what has happened is that groups of workers have gotten together and launched lawsuits. It's a form of a class action lawsuit. It's actually called a collective action lawsuit, in which they basically go to court to force their employer to compensate them for the pay that they've been cheated out of. And now, I had heard a little bit about these cases in the past, and I knew that Walmart had a bunch of these cases brought against it, but I had no idea how much of this had been going on until I started researching it, because these cases don't get a lot of media attention. So I spent much of the past year going through court records, finding all these cases, and they're mostly settlements. And I was astonished to see that almost like every large corporation has had one of these cases, and some of them have had multiple cases, including a lot of the big banks. So I used the same approach of going back to the original source, gathering the information, creating an entry for violation tracker, and then later linking the company named in the individual case to the ultimate parent. And we did this, focused on the wage theft cases, and we were able to document more than $8 billion in settlements and some verdicts going back to the beginning of 2000. Now, of course, Walmart was at the top of the list, with more payouts than anyone else, but the list, the top 10 also included a bunch of banks, including Bank of America, J.P. Morgan Chase, our old friend Wells Fargo, and some of these involved tellers and kind of back office employees. These are lower paid people, but some of the investment houses were also cheating people who had titles like financial analysts. So the conclusion we reached is that wage theft really had become part of the business model for a lot of large companies, and they just decided it was worth doing this until they got caught, and when they got caught, they would reach a settlement, and then in many cases they would go on doing it.
Let me ask you that, and it's tough to tell. I know that you're having to do it from the outside in. Again, you don't have the power of subpoena. in other words, is the penalty basically just the cost of doing business? Is there an actual deterrent effect from the level of the penalty, in your opinion?
Well, the problem is that the law in this area is complicated, and the burden of proof can be difficult. Once you get into these kinds of details of these cases, and so and what happens in a settlement is that the lawyers will often take less than than the theoretical amount that the workers were cheated out of. Right. Just to avoid the trouble of going to court and having a long, drawn-out process. Like any kind of lawsuit, right. They will settle. And, of course, these are plaintiffs' lawyers. They're doing this not necessarily for only noble motives.
Right. They're not activists,
they want to,
right.
Yeah, so they want to make kind of a quicker buck on this. So you can't necessarily say that the amount of the settlements is equal to the amount of the money that's stolen from workers. Now, there have been some separate attempts. The Economic Policy Institute has put out some reports where they attempt to estimate the actual amount of that workers are cheated out of. So we didn't try to reproduce that. We just wanted to show the frequency of these lawsuits and name names.
Well, you're kind of diving into the weeds with that report, basically.
Yeah, and and to show that it's not only the likely suspects. It's not only Walmart and the the fast food operators and other retailers, but it's it's banks, it's high tech companies, and all kinds of other things. It's pharmaceutical companies. There are cases in which pharmaceutical sales representatives have brought suit. So they cheat. They cheat a lot of people. Is the point.
Right. No, because exactly when I hear wage stuff, you said exactly. I picture retail manager, and I think that's what most people think of. Exactly, the lower paid workers. But like you're saying, it's people making middle class and upper middle class wages as well who are getting screwed.
Yeah.
Well.
Yeah. So anyway, so all that data was put into a report, called Grand Theft Paycheck, which is linked on the violation tracker page, among other places, and all that data is also in violation tracker now. So you can do searches, specifically for that, for those kinds of cases. Both the lawsuits and the wage and hour cases from the Justice Department. We've also started collecting data from state agencies that do some of their own enforcement in this area, and so there's some of that in violation tracker now as well. And that's one of the, so the directions that we're going to move in with violation tracker are first other kinds of private litigation. And the thing I'm working on now is employment discrimination and harassment cases. And the plan is to do a similar report, naming names, which companies have been involved in these cases the most, and then adding the data to violation tracker.
That would be very important work. There's so much, because you hear about this a lot of times, though. These companies, PR agencies, they've kind of manipulated the story. Exactly, we need something that gets directly to the source. One question though, when you were doing the research for this, are most of these cases, are they private lawsuits or is it government enforcement?
Well, there are two categories. So one category are cases in the wage theft area that are brought by the Labor Department's Wage and Hour Division.
Right.
And those are basically enforcement actions. The Labor Department, shows up at a workplace, they examine the books, they talk to workers, they determine that there's been there have been infractions, and they impose a penalty on the company that's based on the estimated amount of back pay, plus some additional penalty. So those are the kind of, you could call those the public cases, the government cases. Right. Then there are also some state government cases, and it's very uneven among the states. California and New York, for example, are very aggressive in this area, and a lot of states do next to nothing. So and some states are willing to share the information on their cases, like California. Others, like New York, gave me the runaround, and I still haven't gotten the data yet on their cases, because they don't put it up online. The only state I've found that put up data online about their state enforcement on wage theft is Massachusetts, that has a web page. So we've had to file lots of open records requests, and in many cases we were turned down, including New York, in part because they're claiming that, if we were asking for information on a specific case, that's okay. But if we want a list of all the cases in spreadsheet form, right, they say, no, we don't have to do that because you're... Anyway, that's another story. But anyway, so those are the public categories. Then the report, the Grand Theft Paycheck Report, was mainly about the private cases, and these are cases, where a group of workers get together and they work with a plaintiff's lawyer, and they file one of these collective action lawsuits, in federal court, sometimes in state court, particularly in California, and they go through the usual procedures in a lawsuit, and if they've got a good case, they probably end up settling with the company, and a lot of these settlements are for $1 million or multi-million dollars. So those are the cases that generally don't get a lot of press attention, and that was our main objective, was to document all those cases and add them to the database. Now, the future of that litigation is really in question because of a recent Supreme Court ruling. So as one of the last kind of parting blows of this Supreme Court season, the court handed down this ruling in a case called Epic Systems. And basically what the court said was that companies or employers can compel their workers to sign mandatory arbitration agreements as a condition of being hired. And what that agreement would say is that if you got a problem with, for example, our wage and hour practices, you've got to take it up through arbitration, and you can't go to court. And what that will do is basically prevent these collective action lawsuits from happening, because the workers are barred from going to court, and they got to go to arbitration, and
they can't do anything collective.
Right. So it's individual arbitration, which is it's really almost impossible in a lot of cases for workers to assemble the evidence that they need and make their case. They probably can't afford a lawyer to pursue that. So chances are they're just going to give up and say, the hell with it. Or they may pursue it in a half-hearted way, and they'll get a token settlement. Right. And in any event, the company's going to avoid paying out anything significant. So that's what the Supreme Court has given us. At the same time, more bad news is that the Trump administration is apparently trying to weaken the wage and hour division of the Labor Department, and they've come up with a proposal for what they call self-auditing. It's basically telling companies that they're on the honor system, And if they somehow realize that accidentally they've been cheating workers out of their proper pay, they can report it to the Labor Department and and probably pay a minimum penalty or nothing at all. But what this is really doing is telling them, look, go ahead and do whatever you want. We're not going to enforce the Fair Labor Standards Act. So really the only hope for the foreseeable future is at the state level, states like California that are aggressively pursuing this, or in some places, actually the local level. Some local district attorneys around the country are saying, hey, we can pursue this actually as a criminal case, that, wage theft is not just a metaphor. It can, it's actually literally true. There is a theft, going on here. And in some cases, they are, bringing criminal cases against, egregious employers. So this could be an interesting development.
Is that kind of a first? Has this crime always just sort of been punished in civil courts, or have there been? I mean, again, we're not talking.
Yeah, I think it's a recent development that some district attorneys' offices are doing it, and there have been some cases brought. There have been some cases brought in New York, for example, and we've got a few of them in Violation Tracker now. And by the way, you can distinguish between civil and criminal cases when you do your search in Violation Tracker.
Yeah, and that's one thing I would tell to listeners. It is a very user-friendly database. You don't have to be a really technical person. If I can figure it out, anybody else can figure it out, I promise you.
All right, well, great. I'm glad to hear that. And you can download your search results into spreadsheets and among other features.
Let me ask you this: are there any real recommendations as far as how to prevent this or wage theft? That is.
Well, I tend to think that unionization is probably the best way to do it. I mean, I found that there were not a lot of these cases at unionized employers. Okay. Because unions are able to police this kind of thing on their own, and you don't even need the government to step in. So that's probably the best solution, for workers to basically band together and form unions or work with labor centers or other organizations to try to combat these abuses.
Okay. Yeah, unfortunately, there's also a lot of obstacles to that as well.
Oh, yes. That's another thing that the Supreme Court has been busy doing.
Right.
And will be doing more of. Yeah.
Is there anything else that you'd like to tell the audience about any projects coming up or anything like that? Well, you mentioned a little bit earlier.
Yeah, I mentioned the employment discrimination work, and that's what's going to occupy me for probably most of the rest of this year. We're looking into other things like getting into other areas of state enforcement activity. There are certain areas like insurance that is regulated mostly at the state, not the federal level. And we want to collect information on those cases. And at some point down the line, we may want to look at selected foreign data, because corporate crime is not limited to the United States.
Most definitely.
So, I mean, the rap sheets currently for those companies do have information on foreign corporate abuses, but so far Violation Tracker is just domestic. But at some point we'd like to, gather information, probably starting with, Canada, UK, European Union, and then take it from there and see what's feasible. I mean, it gets more complicated when you're talking about, abuses, in other parts of the world that, there might not be much enforcement going on.
Not much transparency
we've even,
either.
Yeah. I mean, we've, considered, maybe using data from some of the nonprofit groups that are doing, for example, factory monitoring in poorer countries. but that's at least a couple of years in the future. We've got plenty of other things to do.
Oh, yeah.
And then periodically we just update the database from all the existing agencies that we cover, and that by itself is a chore. But we want to keep it updated. We can't update it too frequently because the processing of the data, including the parent subsidiary matching, is somewhat time consuming. So we're trying to keep to a schedule of updating it basically, every 3 months or so.
Okay, that makes sense. All right. Well, hey, I really want to thank you for coming on the show. We talked before. I know that you're not as active with social media. You have a Twitter account. What's your handle for Twitter there?
It's Dirt Diggers.
Oh, that's right. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
I'm going to link to that as well. I definitely recommend that people check out your blog, the Dirt Diggers Digest. It is very interesting, very, very alarming. But yeah, again, I want to thank you for coming on the show. And to all the listeners, give it a 5-star rating and share it as well. And really the best way to support the podcast is to go out there and buy a copy of my 3-book series, Rackets. It's on the legalization of drugs and gambling and the decriminalization of prostitution. So on that note, again, I'd like to thank everybody and have a great day.
It's a big club, and you ain't in it.
I am concerned that the size of some of these institutions becomes so large that it does become difficult for us to prosecute.
You can have a license. Price is $250,000. Plus a monthly payment of 5% of the gross of all 4 hotels in the store. Corleone.